Welcome to this overview of the changes to the 2023 Elevation Certificate. In this training, we'll start with a little background about the Elevation Certificate form. We'll connect the recent form changes to the way that flood insurance is rated, and then we'll talk through the changes to each section of the form, including two new sections, H and I. Let's begin. Floodplain managers from participating NFIP communities are required to collect information from developers to document the surveyed elevations of the lowest floors of new buildings and for existing buildings that are substantially improved. This required data is used to make floodplain management decisions and can be provided in other formats, but FEMA's elevation certificate is designed specifically for this purpose. For communities that participate in the Community Rating System, or CRS, using the elevation certificate form is required for all new construction and substantial improvement inside the special flood hazard area. The elevation certificate, or EC for short, is designed to collect information that facilitates compliance with floodplain management regulations. The EC can also be used to support applications for letters of map change, and though it's no longer required, ECs can be used to support flood insurance rating in any flood zone. The new form was implemented on July 7, 2023, and is currently available for download at FEMA.gov. The previous form has been approved for use until November 1, 2023. Copies of a completed elevation certificate form will likely end up in several places and be used for many different purposes. Accuracy on the elevation certificate is critical for all the different applications. Errors can lead to invalid floodplain management decisions and incorrect flood insurance premiums for the building owner or occupant. Today we'll talk about which sections of the new EC can be used for the various purposes. The elevation certificate form is usually updated about every 3 years or so, and with each update we address emerging issues and provide clarification. While the blank form itself expires, once an elevation certificate is completed and certified for a building, it does not expire. It can be used for floodplain management and for insurance rating decisions indefinitely, as long as the building and its adjacent grade have not been altered in such a way that it would modify any information that's been certified, specifically measurements and elevations in sections A, C, E, and the new section H. If modifications have been made to the building or its adjacent grade, a new elevation certificate should be generated using the latest version of the form. A new form would be required, for example, if there's been substantial damage or substantial improvement to the building, or any modification that changes the information on the elevation certificate, making it invalid. This new version of the form addresses several key issues. There's a new section that property owners can use to self-certify the building's first floor height in any flood zone without a professional survey. The expanded instructions clarify things that have been confusing or ambiguous. The new form collects more detailed information that floodplain managers use when regulating floodplain development. For buildings that have a combination of engineered and non-engineered openings, there have been some changes in Section A that make that easier to document. The instructions have also been updated to reflect new contact and website information. FEMA approved an extension on the 2019 edition due to some technical difficulties with the new form that will soon be addressed, so both versions are acceptable until November 1st, 2023. After that, all new ECs must be done on the new 2023 edition. That's especially important for communities in the Community Rating System, where it's considered an error if you're using an outdated form. Let's review some common terms that are used on elevation certificates. The FIRM is the flood insurance rate map. That depicts the community's flood zones. The flood insurance study details the history of a community's flooding and the methods used to determine the flood risk, and also provides more detailed information than is shown on the FIRM. The base flood elevation, or BFE, represents the surface water elevation in a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. And the special flood hazard area is the area that's expected to be inundated during that event. The lowest and highest adjacent grade are measured immediately next to the building, where the foundation or building support touches the ground. The bottom floor is the building's lowest enclosed area. It could be a basement, a garage enclosure, or a crawl space. The bottom floor is determined and recorded by the surveyor. The lowest floor is a floodplain management term, and it could be the bottom floor or a higher floor. It's usually the one that has no flood openings, it's being used for living space, or in some cases, it could be an enclosure that has utilities. The lowest floor is not determined explicitly by the surveyor. It's interpreted by the community's floodplain administrator based on the building's diagram, foundation type, and other factors. And now we have a new term that's only used for the purpose of rating flood insurance. First floor height is the first living floor of the building that is at or above grade. We'll cover this in much more detail later in this training. FEMA has updated the NFIP's insurance rating system, leveraging industry best practices and cutting-edge technology to enable FEMA to deliver rates that are actuarially sound. They're easier to understand, they better reflect a property's flood risk, and the elevation certificate documents several characteristics that can be used to support more favorable flood insurance premiums. Let's talk about those now. Flood zone and BFE are no longer used as direct rating variables. FEMA now has the ability and tools to incorporate more flood risk variables. These include things like flood frequency, type of flooding, distance to the flooding source, and unique building characteristics like the cost to rebuild the structure. Structural variables, like the building's elevation, are now used for rating flood insurance in all flood zones, not just those in the special flood hazard area. And this is one of the major updates that has been incorporated into the new elevation certificate. Many of the building characteristics that affect the structural variables are recorded on the elevation certificate form. To some extent, the data for geographic location variables and some of the mitigation discounts are also captured on the elevation certificate. As you can see from this list, the elevation certificate captures many of the building elements that are needed to determine the insurance rate, including the foundation type, the first floor height, and the lowest adjacent grade. You've probably already learned about the 6 new classifications of foundation types used as structural variables for insurance rating. These 6 foundation types correlate to the 11 building diagrams that are used in the elevation certificate in Section A. There are no major changes to those 11 diagrams in the 2023 edition, but it's worth noting how they relate to the foundation types. For example, slab-on-grade foundations match with diagrams 1A, 1B, and 3. An elevated building with no enclosure aligns to diagram 5. An elevated building on solid foundation walls is diagram 7. Basement foundations are diagrams 2 and 4. Buildings elevated on posts, piers, or piles with an enclosure are diagram 6. And buildings with crawl spaces are diagrams 8 and 9. Flood insurance discounts are available for policyholders with proper documentation of flood openings compliant with 44 CFR 60.3 and for machinery and equipment that's elevated above the first elevated floor. Eligibility for both discounts could be documented on the elevation certificate. The building's flood openings are documented on Section A of the EC, and the machinery and equipment elevation is documented in either Section C or in the new Section H. In summary, the elevation certificate has been updated to support more accurate flood insurance rating in all flood zones without the need for a professional surveyor. Surveys will still be needed for floodplain management decisions, and the new form helps floodplain managers by recording more specific and clearer details about the building and its flood openings to determine whether they are compliant with local floodplain management regulations and building codes. This enhanced information is also used to determine eligibility for mitigation discounts. Flood insurance doesn't require flood zone as a direct rating variable anymore, but floodplain managers and lenders still need to know the flood zone for regulatory and lending decisions, and Section B has now been updated to better support those decisions. In Section C and E, we have changes that relate to determination of first floor height, and the new Section H will be used to rate buildings based on their first floor height, even outside the SFHA. Now you know why the form changed. Let's talk about what specifically is new and different. Every section of the form has been modified. Section A has been expanded to ask for additional information. Section B is also asking for additional information. There's more detailed instructions for Section C and Section E. Additional information in the surveyor certification and property owner sections, D and F. We've expanded Section G, that's for community officials. And then we have the new sections. Section H to document first floor height for insurance purposes only, and Section I is for property owners or their representatives to certify their measurements in Section H. So let's go section by section through the changes. Section A of the elevation certificate can be completed by anyone, the community or the property owner or the surveyor. And it's where we capture information about the building's location, the type of foundation, the latitude and longitude, and information about flood openings. There's a new horizontal datum option, WGS 84. There's a new checkbox there. And we're now asking for 4 photographs of each building when possible, instead of only 2. For row houses and other buildings where you can't photograph 4 sides of the building because only the front and back are visible, 2 pictures will be okay. In all other cases, the form asks for 4 photographs showing all 4 sides of the exterior of the building. Pictures should also capture things like flood openings, machinery and equipment, and they should support the selection of the building diagram. As I said earlier, there are no major changes to the 11 building diagrams, but there is a clarification in the instructions regarding the differences between Diagram 7 and Diagram 8. Specifically, that when the crawl space height is more than 5 feet, generally that's 4 feet to the top of the foundation wall, assuming a 12-inch floor joist, resulting in a 5-foot difference between the bottom floor and the next higher floor, that's not a crawl space. If it's more than 5 feet, we'll use Diagram 7. This is not a policy change. It's just a clarification about what the difference is between the Diagrams 7 and 8, now in print in the instructions. The elevation certificate still collects information about the area of the crawl space or enclosure areas, which still apply to building diagrams 6 through 9. There is no change here. But here's a little reminder that an attached garage, A9 on the elevation certificate, is one that is attached and next to the building or beside the building, not underneath or separate from the building. On the left here, you see an illustration of an attached garage with a common wall. It's a single structure. If you have a garage that's actually the first floor of an elevated building, like the one on the right, where you're parking on the bottom floor and it's actually underneath an elevated building, that's not an attached garage, that's an enclosure. And so those measurements should be included in section A8, not in A9. Here you can see the building on the left is elevated and they're parking on the first floor. That garage is an enclosure used for parking, not an attached garage. And the measurements for that area should be recorded in section A8. The one on the right is an attached garage, and you would record its dimensions and the flood openings in section A9. A permanent flood opening is one that allows for the free passage of water automatically in both directions without any human intervention. The new form collects more information about these flood openings than before. Sections A8 and A9 have been expanded to more closely align with building codes, ASCE 24, and the minimum standards of the NFIP. For NFIP compliance, enclosures subject to flooding need 2 openings for every enclosed area and at least 1 square inch of opening per square foot of enclosure. But ASCE 24 and most building codes require that there be openings on at least 2 different sides of the enclosure. Previously, the elevation certificate did not capture that. Now, under A8B and A9B, there's a new question. Is there at least 1 permanent opening on 2 different sides of the enclosed area or the attached garage? That's a yes, no, or NA response. We only count flood openings that are within 1 foot of the adjacent grade, either the interior grade or the exterior grade. If the bottom of the opening is 12 inches or less from the ground, then it can be counted. But if it's higher than 1 foot on both sides of the wall, then it's just not a flood opening, and it should not be recorded at all in Section A. Here are some examples of flood openings that might be counted. Many openings have louvers or some sort of grate or covering over them. The 1-to-1 requirement assumes that there will be screening. So if it's a 1/4 inch mesh, then we don't have to deduct any inches from the overall measurement. But if you have louvers, bars, or any kind of decorative material, then you'll have to subtract the area of that material from the overall area of the opening to account for that blockage. If the louvers can be closed and the flow of water therefore obstructed, then deduct 100% from the area, resulting in as little as 0 square inches of opening. Some buildings have multiple types of flood openings. They'll have non-engineered openings and engineered openings, so let's review the difference. Non-engineered openings are permanent openings that have no moving parts. They allow the water to go in and out of the enclosure without any human intervention. The minimum requirement for non-engineered openings is 1 square inch of opening per square foot of enclosure. Engineered openings are activated under flood conditions. They usually have moving parts that will allow the water to go in and out. They must be certified to meet the design and performance criteria in ASCE 24. In order to be considered engineered flood openings, they must also have an individual certification from a professional engineer or an evaluation report from the International Code Council's evaluation service. That certification must be attached to the elevation certificate and detail the enclosed area of the building that each vent is rated to cover. Without this certification, the opening cannot be considered engineered, and its actual net area, in its non-activated state, must be used, which could be as little as 0 square inches. The elevation certificate form now asks for the number of openings that are non-engineered and the number of openings that are engineered. If that ICC report for an engineered opening is not attached to the elevation certificate form, then the vent cannot be considered to be engineered. On the ICC evaluation report, you'll see that there's usually an area of the enclosure that each opening is rated to support. For example, this ICC report shows that a vent of this type will cover 220 square feet of enclosed area. So if you have 4 engineered openings that are rated to cover 220 square feet each, then you have a total net rated area of 880 square feet. The new form now accounts for the possible combination of the rated area of the engineered openings, recorded in feet, and the net area of non-engineered openings, recorded in inches. And you add those up to get the total net rated area, which gets recorded in A8F or A9F. If the building only has one type of openings, then you enter NA in the fields that don't apply. A8F and A9F are only for enclosures that have two different kinds of openings, both engineered and non-engineered openings. If the form doesn't allow you to enter the NA text in the number field, just leave it blank and enter a note in the comments if needed. The instructions for each section of the form have also been updated to align with the form changes. Section A instructions now clarify the requirement for 4 photographs, the new horizontal datum, and now the requirement for latitude and longitude to be to 6 decimal places, and for the lat-long method and source to be indicated in the comments. The instructions include prompts about engineered openings and clarify that ICC or other documentation should be attached. And there are additional instructions about using section A8 and A9 when there are both engineered openings and non-engineered openings present. The changes in section B are mostly just about clarity in the instructions, but there are some updates. The community name and community number have been split into 2 different boxes, B1A and B1B. This will impact CRS communities that need to have both of these correct now, rather than just one or the other. In B10, the word profile has been removed from the FIS box, so any use of the flood insurance study for determining BFE can be indicated with that selection. There's a new field, B13, to indicate whether the building is located seaward of a limwa. If there's no limwa on the map, then the answer is no. In a coastal area with a limwa and a building that is located seaward of that limwa line, you check yes. We don't want this to be left blank. If there is no limwa on the map, or if the building is not in a coastal area, then just check the box that says no. In the new Section B instructions, there's clarification in B7 that LOMAR case numbers and the effective dates should be recorded in the comments section D when applicable. Enter the effective firm date in section B and then the LOMAR information in the section D comments. Remember that for B9, that's the BFE, we're going to use the appropriate table in the flood insurance study, the transect table, the floodway data table, or in some cases you'll use the firm. But whatever that source is, we want the BFE rounded to the nearest tenth of a foot. In Puerto Rico, we round to the nearest tenth of a meter. If the building is located in more than one flood zone, we're going to list all the applicable flood zones and BFEs. The BFE that's recorded in section B9 must be based on hydrologic and hydraulic analyses. Otherwise, it belongs in the section D comments. In B10, we indicate the source of the BFE or the base flood depth. If the BFE is from a source other than the flood insurance study or the flood insurance rate map, there are now clearer instructions about what details to include about that other source. The instructions for Section B have been updated to explain that in B12, we indicate whether the building is located within a COBRA zone or otherwise protected area. COBRAs and OPAs are no longer shown on newly published firms. The Fish and Wildlife Service website, fws.gov/CBRA, is the correct source for those maps. And finally, for B13, if the building is located seaward of a limwa line that's present, then we say yes, otherwise check no. Do not leave this box blank. Let's move on to Section C. Section C is for flood zones with a base flood elevation or a base flood depth. C2 now clarifies that this section can be used for AO zones and A99 zones. This section has to be completed by a licensed survey professional. There's a new datum conversion factor checkbox asking the surveyor to check the box that indicates whether they used one, and if so, to describe the source of their conversion factor in the comments. Section C may be used to document first floor height for insurance purposes in any flood zone, including B, C, X, and D, though it's only required for zones with a base flood elevation. Section C2A records the same bottom floor just as before, but now has additional instructions for clarity. In Section C2A, enter the elevation measured at the top of the bottom floor, excluding the attached garage. Enclosures used for parking are recorded in C2A. For buildings elevated on crawl spaces, enter the lowest elevation at the top of the crawl space, regardless of whether or not the crawl space has permanent openings. For C2B, there's no change in the form, but additional instructions indicate the proper way to measure that floor. Section C2B is only for building diagrams 2A through 9 in any flood zone. For buildings that have more than 2 floors or levels to be surveyed, we can record additional elevations in the Section D comments and then specify which of those floors were entered as C2A or C2B. In C2C, there has been a change on the form. The only for V zones phrase was removed because of, coastal A zones and other areas regulated as being subject to coastal flooding. The result is that the elevations will be recorded for more than just V zone buildings. There's no change in the way it's measured. It's still the elevation of the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member. If this item doesn't apply to the building, just enter NA. If the current version of the form isn't allowing text in the number fields, you can leave it blank and use the comments to explain. Earlier, we reviewed the definitions for 3 different floors. So while we're talking about floor elevations in Section C, let's break down the differences so you'll understand which of these are recorded here. Bottom floor is an objective elevation recorded by the professional surveyor. It could be at grade, above grade, or even below grade. Bottom floor could be a slab floor, a raised slab, a crawl space, an enclosure, a basement, and it can even be elevated on posts or piers. Bottom floor is recorded on the elevation certificate as either C2A or E1. The lowest floor elevation is something that's interpreted by the community official based on multiple measurements, elevations, and characteristics of the building. Lowest floor is not used for rating flood insurance, but communities still use it to determine compliance with local floodplain management regulations. Lowest floor is recorded in Section G9A. First floor height is used for rating flood insurance. The first floor height will always be at or above grade. It does vary by foundation type, and it's recorded in Section H. It can be interpreted from information provided in Section C, but it's specifically called out in Section H. For C2D, there's no change to the form. It records the lowest point of the slab floor in an attached garage. A garage that's the first floor of an elevated building with other floors above it is not an attached garage, it's just an enclosure. The example on the left is an enclosure floor used for parking, and it's actually C2A, not C2D. The one on the right is an attached garage, so C2D would be the garage floor slab at its lowest point. In C2E, a prompt has been added to describe in the comments the machinery or equipment that was measured. Machinery and equipment elevation requirements are different for floodplain management compliance than they are for the requirements to get the M&E flood insurance discount. In previous versions of the elevation certificate, there was some confusion about which machinery should be recorded here. So the elevation certificate form instructions now provide an example, non-exhaustive list of machinery that could be measured for C2E. This is intended to prompt surveyors to measure the lowest of all machinery, not just the lowest of those listed in the instructions. If you'd like to read more about how to protect machinery from flood damage, check out FEMA Publication 348. Information about the mitigation discounts can be found at FEMA.gov. There's a new box in C2F and C2G for indicating whether the adjacent grade measured is finished ground level or natural ground level. Checking one of these boxes is required. Historically, we only used finished grade here, but now we're asking the surveyors to indicate whether the ground is finished or natural grade. Natural grade is the undisturbed natural surface of the ground prior to any excavation or fill. If in doubt, select finished. For C2H, where we measure the ground elevation of the deck support or stairs, only finished grade should be indicated. That's now clear on the form. There are known issues with the current version of the form where it isn't allowing text in the number fields. Underwriting is aware of this and they're working on a resolution. In the meantime, where you would enter NA, if the PDF doesn't allow that entry, you can leave it blank and use the comments to explain. Instructions for Section C have been updated, providing additional detail and clarity. For example, there are clarifications on the new natural versus finished grade options and instructions on procedures to follow if access to the crawl space is limited. We recommend that you read through all the instructions so you don't miss anything important. Don't just rely on the form questions and prompts. The instructions are much clearer than they were in the past, with important details that you will need to correctly complete and review the form. Section D only has minor changes, but you'll like them. Section D is used by the surveyor or other licensed professional who completed Section C. Here they sign and seal to certify that their surveyed elevations are correct. The change here is the addition of a field for their email address. All fields are required in this section. There are a lot more prompts for the comments in the Section D instructions. Section E is for building measurements, not surveyed elevations. Surveys are not required for Section E. The section is primarily used for AO zones and A zones without BFE, and the form now clarifies that it also applies to AR AO zones. All measurements in Section E should be relative to natural grade when that is known. In Section C1, there are checkboxes to indicate the condition of the building at the time of the certification, and those boxes have been added here in Section E. The checkboxes are there to indicate whether the measurements are based on drawings, on a building under construction, or for finished construction. Here are the expanded instructions for Section E. There's a prompt for community officials to double check the measurements if they're using them to document compliance with local regulations. There are more clarifications about what natural ground means. Again, it's the undisturbed natural surface of the ground prior to any excavation or fill. There's also clarification about the relevant machinery and equipment to be measured. There's just one noteworthy change to the form in Section F. This section is where the property owner will certify their measurements from Section E. The change here is the field for the owner's email address, just like there was for Section D. Section F's instructions now clarify that if a community official is completed Section E for documenting compliance, they're prompted to use Section G to certify that elevation information and will not complete or sign Section F. Speaking of Section G, there are several changes here. CRS communities, or those working with CRS communities, will want to follow along. Note at the top of the section, the header now reads recommended, not optional. Community officials who record elevations or measurements themselves in other sections should be using Section G to certify their measurements or entries and use Section G comments to document the development or permit process, including any special circumstances or conditions. Section G connects other parts of the form to the local permit and variance decisions. There are also new checkboxes to document compliance with higher standards. And CRS is now requiring participating communities to complete this section. Specifically, G8 every time, G11 every time, and local officials must provide name, signature, and date in Section G every time. There are other new requirements for CRS communities working with the elevation certificate. Those details have been shared with participating communities and will be detailed in supplemental training materials coming soon. Item G2 is split to indicate what other sections the local official may have completed. G2A is for when the local official completed Section E for floodplain management purposes, and G2B is for when the local official completed Section H for insurance purposes. G3 is a new field that indicates the local official has made some minor corrections to sections A, B, E, or H using the Section G comments. G9 has now been split into G9A and G9B. In addition to the lowest floor elevation, the form now asks for the lowest horizontal structural member, and of course indicate the datum that was used for those elevations. The source of the elevation should be entered in the comments. G10 now links the base flood elevation with the community's freeboard. G10A records the base flood elevation or base flood depth at the building site, and the community's freeboard is recorded in G10B. That's the community's minimum elevation for floodplain management compliance. G11 is new and indicates whether a variance was issued for the building. It's a yes or no answer. If the answer is yes, attach documentation and describe the variance in the Section G comments. All these new changes are described in the instructions. Section G is no longer optional, but recommended for the community official to use in all cases in all zones. G8 instructions prompt communities to indicate whether the building is substantial improvement or repair of substantial damage, whether that's the 50% minimum or a community's higher standard or lower threshold. The two new sections of the elevation certificate are only for flood insurance purposes, but can be used in any flood zone. Surveys are not required. They can be completed by anyone. Section H is used to document first floor height and to determine if all machinery and equipment servicing the building has been elevated. Section I is the certification section for Section H, except when it's completed by a community official who will certify in Section G instead. Remember, an elevation certificate is not required to get flood insurance, but it may establish eligibility for lower premiums and mitigation discounts. If you have an elevation certificate with Section C and D or E and F completed, it can also be used for insurance purposes. But now you have another option that requires just a few measurements. Professional surveys are not required for Section H. It can only be used for flood insurance. There are only 3 questions. In any flood zone, the property owner, their authorized representative, or the local floodplain management official can use Section H to measure the first floor height. Section H will also document whether the machinery or equipment elevation is high enough to qualify for the mitigation discount. Section H is preferred over Section E for documenting first floor height for insurance. But if Section C is completed, it will prevail over Section H for insurance rating purposes and for floodplain management compliance. There are 3 questions in Section H. The first, H1A, is for the top of the bottom floor that is at or above the lowest adjacent grade. This is similar to the bottom floor in C2A, except that it won't apply when it's below grade. H1B is the top of the next higher floor above a basement, crawl space, or enclosure. And finally, H2 is a yes or no question. Is the machinery and equipment elevated appropriately? Let's go back and review the differences between the floor definitions. The bottom floor elevation can be above grade, at grade, or below grade. It can be a slab, a crawl space, and it can be elevated. The lowest floor is used for floodplain management purposes for determining whether a building is compliant. It can be a crawl space floor if it's not vented properly. It can be the lowest horizontal structural member in a V zone. It could be a basement below grade or elevated on a solid foundation wall. The first floor height is always an at or above grade floor. It's the only floor reference that's used for rating flood insurance. First floor height will vary based on the building's foundation type. We only explicitly record the first floor height in Section H, but it can be interpreted from entries in Section C. There are 3 simple rules for H1A and H1B. Rule 1, in Section H only, we never measure a floor that's below ground level. Rule 2, H1A is always at or above existing grade. The underlined text here may help you remember. Rule 3, for buildings with basements and below grade crawl spaces, record the next higher floor in H1B, the first floor that is at or above grade, and leave H1A blank, or NA. We'll go through these rules with a little more detail, but before we do, when we're talking about measuring height in Section H, we're talking about the relative distance between the top of the floor and the existing lowest adjacent grade, or the as-built grade. These are not surveyed elevations. We're using yardsticks and tape measures and rulers to determine the distance from the existing ground up to the first floor of the building. If the property owner wants to use elevations based on natural grade before a building was elevated on fill to potentially qualify for an insurance discount, Section C would be used to provide surveyed elevations certified by a surveyor. Section H is only for measurements of relative height above the existing ground. For H1A, measure the height of the top of the bottom floor that is at or above the lowest adjacent grade. This field gets filled out for all foundation types except for basement foundations and below grade crawl spaces. Again, we only measure above grade floors in Section H. If the building has a subgrade crawl space or basement, just disregard any floor that's below grade. H1B is the height of the top of the next higher floor. For slab foundation types, that's diagram 1A, 1B, and 3, slab foundations. Don't enter anything for H1B. We do use H1B for all other foundation types: basement foundations, post piers and piles, elevated on solid foundation walls, elevated on crawl spaces, and subgrade crawl spaces. We want the top of the next higher floor above H1A, the first floor that's above the basement, crawl space, or enclosure, and at or above existing grade. H2 asks whether machinery and equipment has been elevated. This relates to the eligibility for a flood insurance mitigation discount. Indicate yes in H2 only if all machinery and equipment that services the building, located inside or outside the building, is elevated to or at least the height of the location shown by the H2 arrow in the foundation type diagrams. Two examples are shown here. There's additional clarification in the instructions for section H2 regarding the appliances that need to be elevated at least as high as the elevated floor. For building and contents coverage, all of the machinery and the appliances have to be above the H2 arrow in the foundation type illustrations. Machinery could be inside or outside the building. We indicate no in H2 if any of the machinery is not elevated to the height of the location shown by the H2 arrow. For contents coverage only, H2 applies only to things like clothes washers, dryers, and food freezers that would be covered by the contents policy. Here are the foundation type diagrams again. You can see that each of the 6 foundation types have an H2 arrow, which is always the elevation of the elevated floor or higher. In slab-on-grade buildings that are not elevated, that machinery has to be a full story higher than the slab floor. In these two photos, the blue arrow indicates the H2 floor. On the left, mark yes in H2 because the machinery is at least as high as that elevated floor. On the right, mark no because the machinery is not above the reference floor. You don't have to memorize all of the H2 locations for each foundation type. You can just look at the instructions and follow the H2 line on the matching foundation type illustration. Let's review each of the 6 foundation types, and then we'll go back to the 3 rules. For foundations that are slab on grade with non-elevated floors, diagrams 1A, 1B, and 3, H1A is the first floor that is at or above grade, and H1B is not applicable. A yes in H2 indicates that all machinery is on the second floor or higher, which could be in the attic. For buildings that have a basement, that's diagrams 2A, 2B, and 4, remember the 3 rules. Enter the first floor height in H1B. That's the first floor that's at or above grade. Leave H1A blank because it doesn't apply for basements. You can see on the illustration in the instructions that there's no arrow for H1A to remind you not to write anything in that field. For H2, a yes indicates that all machinery is at least as high as the above grade floor. For buildings elevated on posts, piers, or piles without an enclosure, that's diagram 5, H1A is always the lowest elevated floor, and H1B is not applicable. It's not necessary to indicate a higher floor, even if it is a multi-story building. For H2, a yes indicates that the machinery is at least as high as the elevated floor. For buildings elevated on posts, piers, or piles with an enclosure, that's diagram 6, H1A is the enclosure floor. H1B is the next higher floor, in this case, the elevated floor. A yes in H2 indicates that all machinery is at least as high as the elevated floor. For a building that is on a foundation enclosed by full-story solid foundation walls, that's diagram 7, H1A is the enclosure floor. H1B is the next higher floor, in this case, the second floor. A yes in H2 indicates that all machinery is on that upper floor. For crawlspace foundations, there are 2 corresponding building diagrams, diagrams 8 and 9. Unlike the other foundation types, the approach to H1 is different for each diagram. For diagram 8, where the crawl space floor is at or above the lowest adjacent grade, H1A is the crawl space floor. For diagram 9, remember the three rules? Because the crawl space floor is below grade, we don't measure that floor. Enter NA in H1A and record the next higher floor in H1B. This is the same way we approach basement foundation types. Remember, only measure floors that are at or above grade in section H. In both cases, a yes in H2 indicates that all the machinery and equipment are at least as high as the next higher floor. Let's look at these two examples side by side. The diagram 8 crawl space is at ground level, so for H1A, the lowest floor at or above grade is the crawl space, and H1B, the next higher floor, is the elevated floor. For diagram 9, the crawl space is below grade, so write NA in H1A and record the elevation of the first floor, the elevated floor, in H1B. Again, for section H, just remember the three rules. They only apply to section H. Never measure a floor below ground level. H1A is always at or above grade. And for buildings with basements and below grade crawl spaces, use H1B to record the first floor above grade and leave H1A blank or NA. So what do you think section I is for? This other new section is used by the property owner or their representative to certify the information that they provided in section H. Section I records contact information, including the email address, and there's also a comment box. The property owner is prompted to indicate if there are attachments, such as photographs. But if the local official completed section H, they'll use section G instead of section I to certify their measurements. There are detailed instructions that accompany these new sections. We recommend that you review them so that you can assist property owners who are completing section H for flood insurance. With all these new uses and two new sections, let's review who can complete which section of the elevation certificate form and which sections should be completed for the various EC uses. Section A and B are property information and for firm information. Anyone can complete these two sections, and they're always needed in every case. Section C and D require a licensed professional to complete those surveyed elevations. Anyone can complete Section E, including the property owner, and they'll certify in Section F. Section G is reserved only for the community official to use. And finally, Section H and I can be filled out by anyone, and it's only used for insurance purposes. But let's talk about which sections should be completed if you're using the elevation certificate to document compliance with floodplain management regulations. That is section A and B, and either section C and D or E and F. Notice that section H and I are not on that list. Section C and D are good for all flood zones. Section E and F are only for zones that don't have a base flood elevation or where the flood is measured in terms of depth. Completion of Section G by the community official is always recommended in all cases and required for CRS communities. For flood insurance only, use Section A and B and Section H with certification in either Section I if completed by the property owner or Section G if completed by the community official. If there are surveyed elevations and Section C is completed, it will supersede Section H. Surveyed elevations will always supersede measured elevations. In flood zones where surveys are not needed, that's AO and A zones, FEMA recommends that you use Section H instead of Section E for insurance purposes. To use the elevation certificate to support a letter of map change decision for removing the property from this special flood hazard area, surveyed elevations are required. Sections A and B and then sections C and D are needed for a letter of map change determination. Completion of section G by the community official is recommended. So in summary, there are two new form sections that can be used for flood insurance policy rating without the need for a professional survey. But surveyed elevations are still required for other uses like floodplain management and letters of map change. There are expanded sections throughout the EC to capture additional detail and clarity. Section G has been expanded and enhanced. Community officials can now use it to connect the permit process or the variance decisions and the compliance determinations with higher standards. It's now required for CRS communities. Additional photographs are required to capture building details regardless of the intended use of the form. And finally, updated and detailed instruction pages help clarify how to properly complete the form. Here's a handy guide created to help users of the elevation certificate to identify the appropriate sections of the form to complete based on the flood zone of the structure and the intended use of the completed form. Thanks for watching this overview of the changes to the new 2023 FEMA Elevation Certificate. If you have questions about the form, please email them to nfip underwriting mailbox at fema.dhs.gov.